back, everyone. So we have now talked about kind of the rebirth of the state of Israel. We spent a couple lectures talking about everything from the rise of the Zionist movement all the way until, of course, the United Nations decision to create that two-state solution of an Arab nation and an Israeli nation. And the unfortunate part of this story, that is, of course, one of the more important events in modern Middle Eastern history, is when that agreement was made in the United Nations, pretty much all the Arab countries opposed it. And this is going to lead to a series of wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors. So we're going to start talking about these wars in this particular lecture. And again, as normal when you talk about wars, why did the war start? What happens during the war? Any impacts? Those are the kind of big ideas you want to get as we go through the various wars. We're not going to get through them all in this one particular lecture. We're going to have to break it up into a couple because there's quite a bit to talk about, unfortunately. We wish there weren't. The good news is there will be peace treaties as well we'll get to as well. So that will be the nice part. All right, here we go. So the first war we're talking about is War of 1848, sometimes known as the War of Independence. And in this war, you see the two sides. And you need to know all this, of course, any of the words we put up. So it's going to be Israel, and they're going to fight against Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Yemen. Egypt was probably the fiercest opponent Israel had, but clearly you look at this and you look at the numbers and you go, oh boy, this is not going to be a good situation. Because look at all the countries and all the people. The combined Arab forces combined were about 1 million, right? 1 million forces they had. The entire Israeli military was maybe about 150,000, right? So I think that's a good couple numbers to know. So you're talking about 1 million versus about 150,000. So, do they have any advantages, Israel? They're outnumbered. The other opponents have more men, more manpower, more weapons, and all of that. I guess what you can say is Israel had a couple of advantages. They did get some resources from the United States and England, weaponry to fight this war. And there's a couple other things that, in any war, it's easier to defend than attack. Israel does not need to take over any land to win this war. All they have to do is defend their border. And I think there's one more point about this war. If any of these Arab countries lose, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, what's the worst thing that happened? Maybe they lose a little territory, maybe they get embarrassed, right? But their countries are going to be intact. If Israel loses this war, there's no Israel, right? I mean, what is the main cause of this war? The main cause of this war was the creation of the state of Israel. Israel loses this war, and there's no state of Israel. So obviously, they're a bit more motivated to fight. So those are a couple things, obviously pretty big things, going in favor of Israel during this first war of 1848, or the War of Independence. Here again, some key words about the war itself, what happens, and then the impacts of the war. So here again is this map we used before when we talked about the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And again, to remind you, everything you see on green in this map was areas that were proposed Jewish state, and the yellow is the Arab state. So the war begins, and despite, as I said, being completely outnumbered, by the time we get into 1949, Israel was able to gain the upper hand. They were able to win more of the battles. They were able to push and hold off any of the Arab attacks into that state of Israel now. Now it's, of course, called the State of Israel, starting in May of 1948. So by the time we get to 1949, the Hebrews, the Israelis had won this war. They were able to secure their independence. The Arab countries basically said, we don't want to just keep fighting here. We're just losing men. The casualties, I guess we could start with that, is one of the impacts. There were 6,000, and it doesn't seem like a lot by military standards, but again, if you consider the population at the time, 6,000 was pretty high. That was the number of Israelis that were killed in this war, and there were about 10,000 Arabs killed in this war, the combined countries together. So, well, you say, well, I mean, obviously every life in a war is tragic, but if we can compare it to like the big world wars of hundreds of thousands and millions dead, it's not quite those same numbers, but considering the significance of, the whole establishment of the state of Israel and its being able to be preserved is pretty important. So Israel wins this war, but more importantly than just winning this war is what happens to the territory of the proposed Arab land. Now, this is perhaps the most significant. There's, I could say, two really important impacts of this war. Number one, what doesn't happen? Israel wins, they survive, and their country remains intact. What's the other impact? It's what happens to the Arab nation that was supposed to be created. What happens is several things. So the area of the West Bank, this whole area of the West Bank here, that region was primarily conquered by Jordan, right? So the area of West Bank was primarily conquered by Jordan as a result of this war. So it's not Israel that takes over the West Bank. This is kind of one of the ironies, is that this war was designed to break the Jewish state of Israel, and actually all it led to was a couple other Arab countries conquering more land that was supposed to go to the Arab people, the Palestinians. The territory of Gaza, that went, this whole area kind of down here, you can see in Gaza, that area went to Egypt. So Egypt took control of Gaza, and the West Bank went control of Jordan. Jerusalem, Israel did make inroads into Jerusalem. You're going to see on another map that Israel was able to get a little bit of this land, and they weren't able to take all of Jerusalem. They only took half of it. We'll talk about when they take over the other half. But, you know, in terms of the bulk of the land that was supposed to go to Arab territory, it was not conquered by Israel in 1948 and 49. It was conquered by other Arab countries, Egypt and Jordan, respectively. Now, what this does do is create a major refugee crisis. About 700,000 Arabs who were living in West Bank and Jordan as a result of the war were refugees. They left either to Egypt or to Jordan. Now, one of the often again misconceptions is that it was Israel who forced these Arabs out of the West Bank and Jordan. That is not true. And how do we know it's not true? Well, if you get Israeli sources that tell you it's not true, you should think, well, that's biased. Of course, Israeli sources are going to say we didn't force them out. If you want to show that they were not forced out by Israel, the best sources are other Arab sources. What had happened when this first war began, before the first war began, is that the Arab nations told the other people living in West Bank and Gaza to leave. They basically assumed they were going to win the war. They said, leave West Bank, leave Gaza, and we'll win, and then you can come back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a few primary sources from the Arab leaders and institutions of the time to illustrate this. So just kind of listen to this. So this is from the Arab National Committee in Jerusalem, right? And this is in 1948. Instructions of the Arab Higher Committee ordered women, children, and the elderly in various parts of Jerusalem to leave their homes. Any opposition to this order is an obstacle to the Holy War and will hamper the operation of the fighters in those districts. Okay? Here's another one. The Arab High Committee also ordered the evacuation of several dozen villages, as well as the removal of dependents of dozens more between April and July of 1948. Here's another example. Leaders such as Iraqi Prime Minister Nuri al-Assad, you guys remember him from before, he declared, we will smash the country, referring to Israel, with our guns and obliterate every place Jewish seek shelter in. The Arabs should conduct their wives and children to safe areas until fighting has died down. All right? And then here's another one. The Secretary of the Arab League office in London wrote in his book, the Arabs, the wholesale exodus of Arabs out of this region was due partly to the belief that the Arabs were encouraged by boasting of unrealistic Arab press and irresponsible utterance of some of the Arab leaders that it could only be a matter of weeks before the Jews were defeated by the armies of the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs able to re-enter and retake possession of their country. And last one, the Syrian prime minister said the following. He said this after the fact, but he says, since in 1948 we have demanded the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encourage them to leave. Only a few months separated our call to them to leave and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve to their return. There are so many of those sources, and This is important to understand because this goes to one of the core issues of the modern conflicts in the Middle East and the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because one of the things that you often hear about peace treaties in the Middle East between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors living in Gaza and West Bank is a lot of times the Palestinians say we want a right of return. What does that mean? Well, they want a right of return back to the area that they left in the 1948 war. Where this gets, of course, a little bit complicated is since 1948 till today, Israel has taken over more of that land, and we'll explain why that happens in future lectures. And that population of 700,000 refugees back then has grown, right? If you think of their kids and their grandkids, it numbers well over 1 million. And if you all of a sudden get 1 million people moving into Israel today, what does that begin to do to the demographics of the state of Israel? Remember, the whole point of the creation of the state of Israel was to create a Jewish state. So to give you an idea, in 2015, I'm sorry, about 2000, 2015, roughly, there are 9 million Jewish people, sorry, 9 million people living in Israel. Of those 9 million people in Israel, about 7.5 million are Jews. The other 1.5 million are Muslims and Christians, primarily Muslims, because there are Muslims who live in the state of Israel, which is another interesting point, actually, about the freest places Muslims are in the Arab world are in Israel. Very often you have like homosexuals, for example, who might live in another Arab country and they rather live in Israel, even though they're Muslim Arabs, they rather live in Israel because Israel is a very tolerant nation to the homosexual community, for example. So there's a lot more rights and privileges and so forth. But anyways, in terms of the numbers, what's so important about this, if all of a sudden you get a massive influx into what is modern day Israel of 1.5 million more Muslims coming in who are not Jewish, what does that eventually do to the creation of a Jewish state? And so this is kind of an interesting concern. And there's actually a lot of people in Israel who prefer kind of a two-state solution because of that, because they want the Arabs to have their own country and Israel, the Jewish place, to have its own country. So I know this is a little bit complicated to understand for people who don't have a lot of background in this, but this is more if you hear the term right of return and the refugees referring to West Bank and Gaza, I want you to at least understand where those terms come from. It goes all the way back to this 1948 war when the Arabs left this region because they assumed that they would win the war. Well, they didn't win the war. Instead, West Bank and Gaza, again, as I said, were respectively taken over by Jordan and Egypt, and Israel remained attacked. All right, so all that's important. One last impact of this war, after the war ends in 1948 and Israel gains its independence and is secure, the Arab countries didn't say, oh, well, we're done. They continued attacks against Israel, and these were what we call terrorist attacks, either Fedayeen or Fedayeen attacks. I've seen it spelled a couple different ways, so I gave you two spellings for that. And these were attacks, from the borders, where from Gaza or West Bank, they would, kind of go into the Israel territory, burn villages, attack, small hit and run. So there were these kind of little attacks, primarily from the West Bank and Gaza area. And that's when that began. It started right after the 1948 war. All right, so there's a lot to that. I hope all that's clear. And we're going to move on after the 48 war. What happens? All right, so then we get to the second Arab-Israeli war. This is in 1956, and by now the leader of Egypt is a man named Nasser. There's a picture of Nasser, and he was the one who's going to be most heavily involved in the second Arab-Israeli war. This one's a little different in terms of who's fighting who, so let's kind of explain this. So this is a new map also, and you can see in this map, again, how this land changes. And you can even see here what I talked about, areas controlled by Egypt, areas controlled by Jordan. So this is what I mean by like the Gaza area was taken over by Egypt, the West Bank controlled by Jordan, and the rest of this is the land of Israel now. So in 1956, what led to this war were a few things. You had the Fedayeen attacks. Israel wasn't happy about that. But the other thing you had is the story of the Suez Canal. And Egypt, under Nasser, decided that they were not going to allow Israel to go through the Suez Canal. All right, well, that upset Israel. It kind of gets cut off on this map here, but at the very southern tip of Israel, you can't see it on this map here, there's a gulf called the Gulf of Aqaba. And Israel said, well, okay, we don't have to go through the Suez Canal. We can go down the Gulf of Aqaba, and that kind of circles them around into the various seas they need to get to as well. Well, when Israel wanted to do that, Nasser and Egypt said, well, we're going to put some gunboats there, and we're not going to allow Israel to go through the Gulf of Aqaba. So what Egypt is essentially trying to do is they couldn't defeat him in a war, so they're trying to kind of blockade them by sea. Don't let him go through the Suez Canal. Don't let him go through the Gulf of Aqaba. Well, Israel's not happy about this, but Israel this time was not alone, because England and France were a little ticked off too, because when Nasser took this firm control of the Suez Canal, he made life hard on those countries as well. So when this 1956 war begins, it's Egypt who is now going to face an onslaught from Israel, England, and France, right? And Israel, England, and France are going to be pretty strong, right? And not a surprise, those three countries gain the upper hand pretty quickly in this 1956 war. One person who was kept out of the loop was Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the president of the United States, and he was not too happy about this. And so as this war is going on, Israel's actually making big headway. They're moving into Egypt. They're moving into areas of the Sinai Peninsula. They're starting to move into areas, not just that was part of Israel, they're moving into areas that are part of Egypt. And Eisenhower basically told Israel, quit it, right? We don't want a big old mess on our hand. Let's not keep this fighting going. And you need to stop fighting, or we're not going to give you funds and weapons and so forth. Which kind of put the kibosh on the 1956 war. If Eisenhower says quit it, they're going to quit it. Interesting, this really emboldened Khrushchev a bit. And Khrushchev, this is a little side note. If you don't know it, it's not too important. But Khrushchev was the ruler of the Soviet Union at the time. And he kind of saw, that, Eisenhower was kind of a little bit softer, when he was not allowing Israel to do his thing. He's like, Eisenhower's trying to avoid a big conflict. I think I could be a bit more aggressive in Eastern Europe. And it's not a surprise that in 1956 into early 1960s, the Soviet Union gets a lot more aggressive in Eastern Europe. Part of the reasoning behind this was actually this 1956 war in the Middle East. Because it indicated that to at least Khrushchev, the Soviet ruler, that Eisenhower wasn't ready for like big bloody wars. I don't know how much there is to that. I've read that in a couple sources. It was an interesting read. Anyway, so the war eventually comes to an end, and it's not, it's a ceasefire, right? One of the things about these wars is they're not peace treaties, they're ceasefires. They say, okay, we're going to stop fighting. The other interesting point of these wars is, where are the Arab countries getting a lot of their military support? The Soviet Union, especially Egypt, and that's just another thing worth noting. So when the war ends, basically they draw a truce. Israel agrees to leave the Sinai, all this area that they had moved into Egypt. They say, okay, we'll leave the Sinai. So they leave that area. They say, okay, we won't stay in the Sinai area. And so that was one. Another effect of the war, 1956 war, another agreement, is that the Gulf of Aqaba would be open to Israelis to be able to trade through that region. And that would also have UN peacekeepers in this area of the Gaza region, right? That there'd be UN peacekeepers there. Why did Israel want UN peacekeepers? Well, because they wanted the Fedayeen attacks to stop. So part of the agreement that the war would end is that Egypt would make sure that there were no more attacks, no more of these Fedayeen attacks coming in. So that was, at the end of the day, kind of the basic agreement, that the fighting would stop, that Israel would leave the Sinai that they had conquered parts of during the war, but they would be able to continue to trade through the Gulf of Aqaba, that there would be UN peacekeepers in the Gaza area to make sure there were no Fedayeen attacks. So that was the Second Arab-Israeli War, and a few details about that. Okay, let's move on. The next big event in our timeline is not a war, but something really important, and that was the establishment in 1964 of the PLO. PLO stands for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They have a whole big charter, which you could look up if you'd like to look it up. And this organization established in 1964. If you read their charter, they state that the entire area of Palestine, and the word is very important here, they define Palestine as everything in that region, not just West Bank, not just Gaza. West Bank, Gaza, everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, everything in that area they define as Palestine. And they define that area as a land that should not have the Jewish people in it. So obviously that's not going to go over too well. As the years go by, there are going to be a couple parts of the PLO, Fatah and Hamas. Fatah, we'll talk about this in another lecture a little bit later, so don't worry about it too much. Hamas, you have a primary source in your packet called the Hamas Covenant. You should read that because that's going to be the hard-line terrorist wing of the PLO. They're going to be involved in many, many brutal operations. In bombing of civilians, homicide bombings, all sorts of really horrible, terrible things that are going to happen established by the PLO. And so that's very important what their objective is. Their objective is not just to create a state for the Palestinians. Again, do the Palestinians deserve a state? I would find very, very few people who would say they don't deserve a state. And most people in Israel would agree with that. The issue is, where are those borders? Where are those lines? It's also interesting, this was established in 1964. In other words, it was established before Israel even controlled the West Bank or Gaza. Remember, this PLO was created in 1964. It was created at a time before Israel took over the vast majority of the area of West Bank and Gaza, which shows, because again, sometimes you'll hear, oh, the PLO is established just to create this territory and just a state for the Palestinian people. No, the PLO was created because they wanted no Jewish state there at all. That's the key point, right? If all they wanted was a state for the Arab population in West Bank and Gaza, things would go a lot smoother. But that was not the initial goal. And you could see this yourself by reading the charter. And that's why I say go read the charter yourself, and you'll see a lot more detail there. So that was the creation of the PLO in 1964. All right. Next, 1967 war. This is the Six-Day War. This is maybe one of the most famous wars of the Arab-Israeli conflicts. And we definitely want to kind of talk about this war as well. I'm also going to have a video that you're going to watch on this war. I should be able to link a video for you to give you more information where you can jot down a little bit more notes, get some visuals of the fighting from firsthand footage of it. So what's going to happen here? Well, let's talk about this. Again, there's a map and the causes, and then we'll kind of go back to the map again and some charts and some details. So what had happened was this. Nasser, again, the ruler of Egypt, by now had very close ties with the Soviet Union. He was getting a lot of weaponry, a lot of military arms from the Soviet Union. The Fedayeen attacks began to resume in great numbers. And then in May of 1967, a few things happened. The UN peacekeepers that we talked about before were removed from Gaza. In May of 1967, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all began to mobilize their armies, meaning move their armies closer to the Israeli borders. And in May of 1967, the Gulf of Aqaba was once again closed. Now, unless you're a moron, you know what's about to happen. These three countries are already conspiring to attack Israel again. And Levi Eshkol was the prime minister of Israel at the time. And he's seeing all this, and he's like, oh, crap, right? Here we go again. What is he going to do? Well, he goes to his Secretary of Defense. His Secretary of Defense was this man named Moshe Dayan. And Moshe Dayan, very famous with his eye patch, looked at the situation and said, boss, they're going to attack us and they're going to do a lot of damage. Let's not wait. And he orchestrated one of the most remarkable, just from a sheer military standpoint. I mean, military men study this war to this day, like detailed. because they launched this major, what is called a preemptive strike. And they decided they weren't going to wait for Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to pounce. They were going to take the first strike against them. I want to show you some things here, some numbers. So look at this chart. This is, if you could see this chart here, total Israeli manpower, 250,000. Arabs, 328,000. What I want to mainly look at is the aircraft. Israel had 286 planes. Jordan, 431. The combined is 682. Okay? What Israel is going to do is they are going to take their Air Force, June 1967, and fly them mainly into Egypt. Just take the entire Air Force. This was an amazing risk, right? Because they left almost no planes to defend Israel itself. They took almost their entire Air Force, flew into the Arab territories, and they demolished the Arab Air Force right in the first day of the war. This was this key decision of Moshe Dayan, this preemptive strike. And you can see the other numbers if you want to pause. You can look at all the other numbers. Now, this is a little small, I know. You can't really see the numbers as well here as I would like. I tried to make it bigger. So I'll just run through a couple of these numbers with you. But the most important number you're going to see is Egypt, out of their Air Force, lost 356 of those 430 planes. Basically, the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. I know this is a little small, that's why I put the numbers up. I believe this actually might be in your textbook. I believe these numbers are actually in your textbook, so you can look it up too that way. It's a good table. But the numbers are dramatic. They basically destroyed the entire Air Force that first day. So if you're thinking of a war, and one side has an Air Force and the other doesn't, that's it. That's checkmate, because then all you have to do is move your ground forces in. If the opposition has ground forces, all you do is you take your planes and you destroy the opposition ground force, and then you move in. And that's essentially how the rest of the Six-Day War goes. Very quickly, Israel sweeps in to Israel, Jordan, and Syria and takes over a lot of land very quickly. So this is what they end up taking over, and it's quite stunning when you look at our map here. So this is kind of the map down here is the map what we started with in earlier, if you remember, and the bigger map is now the land that they're going to conquer. So you really want to know all these key terms here, the regions and the countries. So everything in green down here, the Sinai Peninsula, was controlled by Egypt. Israel takes over the entire Sinai Peninsula, which you could see is much larger than even all of the state of Israel. So they basically more than double the size of the state of Israel. Everything on this map in red is the territory they had, after the 1948 war, right? After their War of Independence. So they take over Sinai. They take over the area over here of Gaza, also from Egypt. Up here in the north, they take the Golan Heights from Syria. They take over the entire West Bank from Jordan, including East Jerusalem from Jordan. So this is pretty impressive, right? In terms from just a sheer military perspective, this was a lot of land conquered very quickly. The question, of course, is what does all this mean beyond Israel taking over this land? Obviously, they conquered a lot of land. Later on, we're going to talk about how they're going to give up the entire Sinai Peninsula later on, basically to Egypt. We'll cover that, why that is, for peace. But initially, in 1967, after they did this, they went to the Arab countries and say, hey, what about we give you this land back and we want peace? And I'm going to explain this in a couple slides. That didn't go over too well. Instead, what you have is Israel holding this land, and this is where you have another pivotal point in our story. It's not only that Israel now has conquered this land. When they control the West Bank and Gaza, there aren't a lot of people in the Sinai Peninsula, but there are a lot of people living in West Bank and Gaza. They are now controlling people who primarily are not Jewish anymore. These are Arab, Muslim people, for the most part, living in West Bank and Gaza. Remember, those areas were supposed to be an Arab state that never happened because of what we talked about happened in 1948. And so Israel now holds this territory, and this is where you get into this conflict of these terms, because some people say, well, Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza. Well, Israel was involved in a war. They won the war. They took over the land. A question is, what do you do now, right? What do you do with the million people in this area, a million plus people in this area that never wanted a Jewish state in the begin with, and now not only did they not want a Jewish state, now they are controlled by that Jewish state, right? And so this is going to make more complexities and so forth. Now, historically, when somebody fights a war and you lose and you take over the land, it's their land. As we're going to see, Israel multiple times is going to be willing to give up territory that they had conquered in a war simply for peace. And how that works out, we'll kind of talk about in some other lectures moving forward. But I do want you to make sure you're kind of aware of, in this case, what happened, what land where, and so forth. And then I'll show you some pictures of the Golan Heights, and also this conference that takes place right after the war is what we want to also discuss here. All right, so I hope all that part's clear as we continue on. I do want to just show you a couple quick images from the Golan Heights. Here's one. You're going to see a couple more coming here in a second. Just this area that Israel conquered from Syria. So I just been up there, so I have a few cool pictures to show you here. Conquered. These are some forts at the Golan Heights that you can go and visit. So this is the area that Israel controls. This is a bunker that is there. That doesn't work anymore. This is like a shot up vehicle that took place. One account was during the war, the Arabs forced their soldiers to fight to the point where they chained their soldiers to the bunkers there because they didn't want them to run away. So either fight or die, that kind of thing. And then this is what's there today, because between modern day Syria and Israel, in the Golan Heights, there's kind of this buffer zone, and there are landmines there. And yes, I got about 10 feet to landmine areas there, but that's clearly marked, as you can see. And I didn't go by myself. I know somebody who knew what they're doing and knows the area. But it's not every day you walk around areas where you're 10 feet away from a sign that says landmines. So I kind of always like sharing that. Pretty crazy. So anyways, you have that. All right, so this is what happens in Sudan. The Arab countries meet at Khartoum, the city in Sudan, and their discussion of what to do is this. There's the three no's. They basically say, after they've lost this war, no peace with Israel, no recognition with Israel, no negotiations with Israel. So is Israel going to just give up the land of West Bank and Gaza? Well, of course not. They're going to hold on to that land until those nations around them are at the very least willing to give peace. And they hold the entire Sinai Peninsula. Now, if you know where this story ends up going, Israel will eventually give up a good chunk of that land. They're going to give up the entire Sinai Peninsula eventually. And all they wanted was Egypt's ability to recognize their right to exist. So also, once they take over that land, this term, they occupy that land. Well, once you conquer land, is it occupied land or is it land you conquered? That's obviously depends on your perspective. To the Arab countries, it's occupied land. To the Israelis, it's land we conquered and now it's our land, right? I mean, so that often is one of those things, depends who you ask. But in terms of how it got to that situation, I think that's all very important. So that's the first stage of the wars. We're not done. So that's the 1967 war. That's the Khartoum conference and the three no's. And unfortunately, at this point, it's not looking good. Will things resolve? Will there be some peace treaties? Yes, there will be, but it's going to take at least one more big war. And unfortunately, much more fighting and issues and casualties. And we're going to kind of keep going with that in our next lectures. So hopefully you found those things interesting. And again, I am going to try to link you up a video for the 6-day war as well. So this was a little longer than the other ones. It's just a few minutes longer, but I think it's pretty important stuff, and I didn't want to break it up too much. So there you go. All right. Hope you liked that and you found it interesting. Thank you. Let me know if you have questions.